She was 8 months pregnant, standing in the middle of the most beautiful night of her life, when the door opened and everything she had survived walked back in wearing a burgundy blazer. 200 people in that room, flowers everywhere, music playing, her husband across the room laughing at something his friend just said, her mother in the corner crying happy tears for the third time that evening. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly what she had worked for. And then the door opened, and Francis Cole walked in like he owned the place. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He walked in with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed this moment for 4 hours in the car. Because that's exactly how long it took to drive from New York to Brookline, Massachusetts. He stood just inside the entrance and let his eyes move slowly across the room until they found her. And when they did, he smiled. Not warmly, not nervously. The kind of smile that says, "I know something you don't want me to say out loud." Skylar saw him, and her whole body went still. Not from fear. That part is important. Not from fear, but from the specific exhaustion of recognizing a problem you thought you had already solved, showing up at your front door with a new outfit on. Her best friend Tasha spotted him half a second later. Tasha was already moving, champagne glass still in hand, eyes doing the rapid calculation of exactly how much of a scene she was prepared to cause in the next 30 seconds. Skylar stopped her with one word. She said quietly but firmly, "Tasha." Tasha froze mid-step. Skylar said again, softer this time, I got it. Now, before we go any further, you need to understand something about Skylar Daniels, because if you don't understand who she is before this moment, you won't fully understand what you're about to watch. Skylar grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts. Not the pretty part. She was raised by a woman named Diane who worked double shifts at a laundromat and still came home and made dinner and helped with homework and never, not once, let her daughter see her break. That was Skylar's first education, how to carry weight without showing it on your face. Her second education was 4 years of marriage to the man who just walked through her door. Francis Cole had a talent for making Skylar feel like too much and not enough at the exact same time. Too loud, too ambitious, too particular about things that apparently didn't matter. And somehow, simultaneously, never quite good enough for the life she wanted. She spent 4 years slowly editing herself down, making herself quieter, smaller, more manageable, until one morning she woke up, looked in the mirror, and didn't recognize the woman looking back. She left with one suitcase and a business idea, and she never looked back. That was 3 years ago. In those 3 years, she built Vivid Theory, her brand strategy firm in Cambridge, into something real. She met Lee Soo-hyun at a hospital fundraiser and spent 20 minutes making him laugh without knowing he was worth more money than she would make in 5 lifetimes. She married him in a small ceremony on the Cape. She built a life that felt every single morning like something she had genuinely earned. And tonight, in this house in Brookline, surrounded by flowers and people who loved her, 8 months pregnant with a daughter she and Soo-hyun had already named, was supposed to be the most beautiful night of that life. Comment below right now, have you ever had your past show up right when your life was finally going right? Because what's about to happen next is going to hit very differently, and if this story is already pulling you in, hit that like button and subscribe, because we are just getting started. Skylar walked toward Francis the way you walk toward something you are no longer afraid of, but are deeply tired of. No rushing, no shaking. Her chin was up, her eyes were clear, and she crossed that room with the calm of a woman who had already survived this man once and was mildly insulted that she had to do it again. She stopped in front of him and said evenly, "Francis." Francis looked her up and down, the dress, the baby bump, the house, and said with a smirk, "Skylar." Then he added slowly, like he was tasting the word, "You look comfortable." Skylar didn't flinch. She said simply, "You weren't invited." Francis shrugged and replied casually, "I heard you were having a party. Figured you'd want your people here." Skylar held his gaze and said, "My people are here." He glanced past her at the room, the flowers, the guests, the jazz quartet. And then he looked back at her with something that had been simmering the whole 4-hour drive finally reaching temperature. Francis said, his voice dropping slightly, "So it's true then. You really married some Korean billionaire." He said it the way people say things they intend as insults but need the cover of a question to deliver. Like he was just making an observation. Like he wasn't standing in her home, uninvited, 8 months into her pregnancy, trying to reframe her entire life as a punchline. Then he leaned in slightly and said, "What happened to you, Sky? You used to be real." Skylar looked at him for one long moment. Then she stepped 1 inch closer, close enough that only he could hear what came next, and said quietly, "The last time I saw you, you told me I was too loud, too much, too black, and too ambitious for any man to actually want long-term." She held his eyes and continued, "I just want you to look around this room before you finish whatever speech you rehearsed in that car. Take your time." Francis looked around the room. He took his time. The house, the people, the flowers, and then the man now walking toward them from across the room. Lee Soo-hyun did not rush. He never rushed. There was something about the way Soo-hyun moved through a room that people registered before they could explain why. A kind of stillness in motion that made everything around him feel slightly louder by contrast. He walked directly to Skylar's side, not in front of her, beside her, and he looked at Francis with an expression that had absolutely no readable bottom to it. Soo-hyun said calmly, extending his hand, "I'm Soo-hyun." Francis shook it. His body did it before his brain caught up. He said with forced steadiness, Francis Cole, I'm an old friend of Skylar's." Soo-hyun nodded slowly, as if genuinely considering this information, and said, "Old friend." Then he added, "She hasn't mentioned you." The room had gone quiet by now. The jazz had softened. People were no longer pretending they weren't watching. 200 pairs of eyes trying to look like they were doing something else. Francis felt it. The ground shifting. The audience he had walked in hoping to perform for now arranged entirely against him. And in that specific panic of a plan dissolving in real time, he made the decision that changed everything. He raised his voice, just enough. Francis said, loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear, "I just came to say congratulations, but I think people here should know." He paused, letting the silence stretch dramatically. Then he said, "The Skylar I knew wasn't exactly the faithful type." The room didn't gasp. It did something worse. It went completely, utterly silent, the kind of silence that has actual weight to it. That presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat feel louder than it should. Even the jazz stopped. The quartet hadn't planned it that way. Silence is just contagious when it spreads fast enough. Tasha took one sharp step forward. Diane, Skylar's mother, reached out immediately and grabbed Tasha's arm. Diane's face was doing something complicated, something that lived exactly between fury and a prayer. And Skylar blinked once, just once. Then she did the last thing Francis expected. She turned away from him, not in retreat, not in humiliation. She turned to look at Soo-hyun, just looked at him, the way you look at the one person in the room who actually knows every version of you. And something passed between them that had no words in it. Something that said, "Without saying anything, can you believe this man is really doing this right now?" Soo-hyun looked back at her. The corners of his eyes moved, barely, almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something that said, "I see him. I see you. I've got this." Then he looked at Francis. Soo-hyun said, his voice perfectly, deliberately level, "My wife is the most faithful person I have ever known. I know this not because I choose to believe her." He paused for exactly 2 seconds and finished, "I know this because I know her." He let that sit in the room. Then he said, still without raising his voice, "You drove hours to a baby shower on a Saturday evening to say something about my wife." Another pause. "That tells me everything I need to know about your life right now." Francis opened his mouth. Soo-hyun said simply, "Security will walk you out. Enjoy your evening." 2 men materialized from opposite sides of the room, quiet, professional, moving with the particular efficiency of people who are exceptionally good at their specific job. Francis looked at them, looked at Skylar, looked at Soo-hyun. Then he looked at the room, 200 people who had witnessed every single second of this, and something cracked just slightly behind his eyes. Not remorse, not yet, just the specific ugly feeling of a man realizing his plan has failed in front of an audience and there is no second act available. He left. The door closed behind him. 4 full seconds of silence. Then Tasha said at full volume, "Somebody top off my drink right now because what just happened?" And the room broke open into laughter and overlapping conversations and the jazz quartet reading the room beautifully. I kicked back into something upbeat and the baby shower slowly, gratefully found its feet again. Skylar's mother came to her immediately, both hands on her daughter's face, checking her the way she used to check her at 12 years old after a hard day at school. Diane said urgently, "Baby, you okay?" Skylar said firmly, "Mom, I'm fine." Diane said, still searching her face. "You sure? Because I was 2 seconds from—" Skylar cut her off gently. "I know exactly what you were 2 seconds from. Sit down, please." Diane sat, still vibrating slightly. Soo-hyun came back to Skylar's side and placed his hand at the small of her back, low, quiet, just resting there, and leaned close enough that only she could hear. He said softly, "You okay?" Skylar said, "I'm fine." He said, "You don't have to be fine right now." She looked up at him. "I know. I actually am, though." She paused, then added quietly, "He looked terrible, didn't he?" Soo-hyun said without missing a beat, "I wasn't looking at him." She laughed, genuine, sudden, the laugh that had made Soo-hyun want to know her better the very first night they met. He smiled at her the way he always smiled at that laugh, like it was something that still caught him off guard even after 2 years of marriage. Skylar said, "Go back to Daniel. I'm going to sit down and eat something before I say something to Tasha that escalates this further." Soo-hyun didn't move immediately. He held her gaze for 1 more second, a long look that was doing a lot of work, then kissed her temple and went. Skylar sat down, and across the room, in the far corner near the window, Young-hee Lee watched all of this and did not join the recovery. She had not laughed with the room. She had not exhaled with the room. She sat with her wine glass and her composure, and she watched her son kiss his pregnant wife's temple and return to his friend, and something moved behind her eyes that was too layered to name quickly. She reached into her clutch, pulled out her phone, typed a short message, sent it, put her phone away. Nobody saw it, or almost nobody. Drop a comment right now. Do you think Young-hee is an enemy, an ally, or something far more complicated? Keep watching, because the answer is going to surprise you. The party wound down around 10. The last guests left in cheerful waves, hugs, congratulations, promises to visit once the baby arrived. Tasha was the last one out, which surprised nobody. She required 3 separate goodbyes and a full debrief at the front door. She held Skylar's face in both hands and looked at her with complete seriousness. Tasha said, "I need you to know that if you had not stopped me tonight, I would have absolutely—" Skylar said, "I know." Tasha continued, "Like, I had a whole plan." Skylar said, "Tasha." Tasha pressed on, "He is lucky Soo-hyun's security got there first is all I'm saying." Skylar said, "Go home." Tasha said, squeezing her hands. "I love you." Skylar said, "I love you. Go home." Tasha went. The house settled into its nighttime quiet. Soo-hyun started cleaning up, or attempting to, while Skylar supervised from the couch with her feet on the coffee table like a heavily pregnant project manager with extremely strong opinions. She directed him through the gift organization with focused energy. Skylar said, "The blue bag goes on the left." Soo-hyun said, "This is the left." Skylar said, "Your other left." He turned the wrong way on purpose. She threw a small napkin at him. He caught it without looking, which was both impressive and deeply annoying. Skylar said, "You practiced that." Soo-hyun said, turning back to the gifts, "I've never practiced anything in my life." Skylar said flatly, "That is a lie." He brought her a glass of water and sat on the arm of the couch near her feet. He looked at her in that quiet way he had, like he was taking inventory, making sure everything was still where it was supposed to be. He asked, "How do you actually feel?" Not the answer you gave your mother. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Brookline was dark and still. She let herself be honest. Skylar said slowly, "I spent so long being afraid of his opinion of me. Like some part of me kept that door open to what he said, that I was too much, that I was difficult to love. She looked at her hands. And then tonight he walked in, and I looked at him, and I felt... She searched for the word. Nothing. Not anger, not old hurt. Just clarity. Soo-hyun gave her silence. He had learned in 2 years of marriage that Skylar's honest moments deserved room. She wasn't asking to be fixed. She was processing out loud, and she needed him present in it, not rushing toward the end of it. Soo-hyun said eventually, "When you turned to look at me, after he said what he said, before I walked over." Skylar asked, "Yeah?" He said, "I have never been more certain of anything." He paused. "Not the company. Not any decision I have ever made. Nothing. You are the clearest thing I have ever chosen." She reached out and took his hand. They sat like that for a while, the two of them in the quiet house, her feet up, his hand in hers, the city dark and steady outside. And it was exactly the kind of moment nobody gets to see when they look at someone else's life from the outside and try to decide what it means. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at it. His jaw moved, barely, 1 millimeter to the left. Skylar said immediately, "What?" Soo-hyun said, "Nothing to..." Skylar cut him off. "Lee Soo-hyun, you did the jaw thing." Soo-hyun said, "I don't have a jaw thing." Skylar said, "You absolutely have a jaw thing. I have been with you for 2 years. What happened?" He turned the phone toward her. A message from his head of security. Brief, coded, just the kind of language designed to say a lot in very few words. It essentially meant, "We need to talk." Escalation. Skylar read it again, looked up at him and said, "Go in tomorrow." Soo-hyun said quietly, "Morning is fine. I don't want tonight to end with that." She nodded, set the phone face down on the cushion. Then she said, "Babe." He said, Skylar said carefully, "Something is wrong, isn't it? Beyond Francis." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Let's talk tomorrow." She studied his face. She knew that face, every version of it. And the version she was looking at right now was not the face of a man brushing something small aside. It was the face of a man who had looked at something disturbing and decided, just for tonight, to put a door between his wife and it. She let him. But she noted it. Soo-hyun left for the office at 7:30 the next morning. Skylar was still technically in bed, but she had her laptop open and was on a client call by 7:45, which was simply her version of sleeping in. The offices of Kwanli Medtech's North American headquarters sat in a glass building in Boston's financial district that looked from the outside like the kind of place where serious people made decisions that changed other people's lives quietly and without drama, which was exactly what it was. Park Jin-woo had worked for the Lee family for 15 years. He was former Korean intelligence, not the kind of background that came up in small talk, and he had the particular quality of delivering terrible information in a completely flat voice, which Soo-hyun had always found both useful and slightly unnerving. Jin-woo laid a thick file on the conference table and stepped back without saying anything. Soo-hyun opened it and read in silence. What he found inside changed the shape of everything he thought he understood about the night before. 3 weeks before the baby shower, Francis Cole had been contacted through a private number. Jin-woo's team had spent time tracing it. The routing had been deliberately obscured, but it connected eventually to a consulting firm operating out of Boston. The firm was a shell company. Behind the shell was a group of minority investors who had been quietly building a case for a hostile restructure of Kwanli Medtech's North American operations for nearly a year. They wanted to break the Lee family's controlling stake. To do that, they needed leverage. Corporate leverage was difficult. The books were clean. Legal leverage was difficult. The family's compliance record was solid. Personal leverage, however, was easier. A damaged marriage, a public scandal, questions about the character of the woman the CEO had chosen to build his life with. Plant enough smoke and people start assuming fire. Investors get nervous. Board members get careful. And suddenly a family that seemed untouchable starts to look like a risk. Francis had been fed a constructed narrative about Skylar, her past, her motives, suggestions about the baby's paternity. He was offered $30,000 to deliver that narrative publicly. He was given the private address of the baby shower through channels that Jin-woo was still working to trace. He was not recruited because he was clever. He was recruited because he was bitter and broke, and someone had correctly identified that combination as useful. Soo-hyun closed the file. He sat very still. Jin-woo waited across the table without speaking. Finally, Soo-hyun asked, very quietly, "Does Skylar know yet?" Jin-woo said, "No, sir." Soo-hyun said, "I'll tell her myself." He drove straight home, not to his lawyer, not to a second meeting. Home, because that was where the person he needed was. Skylar was at the kitchen table when he came in, laptop open, one leg tucked under her in the chair with the casual comfort of a woman who had forgotten she was 8 months pregnant. She was wrapping up a call, her voice in that specific rhythm she used for client negotiations, warm but precise, no room for misunderstanding. She held up one finger at him without breaking her sentence. He made coffee. She finished the call 4 minutes later, smiled at the phone until she hung up, then looked at his face and the smile disappeared. Skylar said, "Sit down." Soo-hyun said, "I'm fine standing." Skylar said again, firmly, "Soo-hyun, sit down." He sat down. He told her everything. The file, Jin-woo's report, the shell company, the investor group, the $30,000, the way Francis had been specifically targeted because of his history with her. He said it all the way through without stopping because he had learned that Skylar received information best when it was given completely, not rationed out piece by piece. She listened the whole way through without interrupting once. He watched her face the way he always watched her face during hard things, the way information moved across her expression like weather crossing an open field, shifting and changing and finally settling into something very still and very clear. When he finished, she was quiet for 10 seconds. Then Skylar said, "They used Francis because they knew I'd be shaken." Soo-hyun said, "Yes." She said, "They researched things about us." He said, "Thoroughly." She said, "This is about the restructure vote, the November board meeting." Soo-hyun stopped. He looked at her and said, "How did you—" She opened her laptop and turned it to face him. There was a spreadsheet on the screen, not a simple one. A detailed, color-coded, annotated document tracking investor movements over 8 months, secondary stake sales, board communication patterns, at the timing of certain public statements, the way specific names kept appearing at the edges of transactions that looked unrelated until you placed them side by side. Soo-hyun looked at the spreadsheet. He looked at his wife. He looked at the spreadsheet again. He said slowly, "Skylar." She said, "I've been watching the Whitmore Group's activity since March. I noticed the pattern when Chen Wei sold his secondary stake in September. The timing was wrong for a normal divestment. Too clean, too quiet." She scrolled down the document. "I didn't know they would go this personal. That part I didn't see coming." She paused. "I was going to tell you after the baby shower." Soo-hyun put both hands over his face, not from distress, from the overwhelming, specific feeling of being married to someone who is simultaneously the most impressive and most exhausting person you have ever encountered in your life. He said, voice slightly muffled by his palms, "You were going to tell me after the baby shower." Skylar said, "I wasn't sure yet. I didn't want to worry you over a theory." Soo-hyun said, "Skylar." She said, I know." He said, "You have been tracking a hostile investor operation for 4 months." She said, "While building the case properly," he continued, "without telling me." She said, "I needed to be sure first." He pressed on, "While pregnant." She said simply, "The pregnancy didn't affect my spreadsheet skills, babe." He dropped his hands and looked at her. She was looking back at him with the specific expression she wore when she knew she had done something he couldn't actually argue with, but that had also, quietly, added several gray hairs to his life. He took a breath and said, "We need to take this to legal." Skylar said, "Obviously, but we also need Francis." Soo-hyun said, "What do you mean we need Francis?" She said, "His testimony. The financial trail is there, but it's circumstantial without a direct human link. Francis was the contact point. He has the number they called from. He probably has messages, account details, everything." She looked at Soo-hyun steadily. "He'll talk to me." Soo-hyun said immediately, Absolutely not. Skylar said. Soo-hyun, he said, you are 8 months pregnant and you want to go meet your ex-husband who stood in our home last night and publicly… Skylar cut in. I'm pregnant, not incapable. Soo-hyun said, that is not the point. Skylar said, he won't talk to Jinwoo. He won't talk to a lawyer. He came last night because somewhere in that decision there was guilt. I saw it on his face when security walked him out. He looked like a man who had already regretted it before he finished doing it. She leaned forward. I know, Francis. I know exactly which version of him to reach. Soo-hyun asked. Which version is that? Skylar said quietly. The one that's ashamed of himself. Soo-hyun looked at her for a long time. The look of a man running every counter-argument available in real time and losing each one to the logic of the woman sitting across from him. Finally, he said, Jinwoo is outside, the entire time. Skylar said, obviously, he said, and you call me the second… She said, Soo-hyun. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. I've got this, and I've got you. Both things are true. He turned his hand over and held hers. He said quietly, I know. That's the only reason I'm agreeing. What neither of them had addressed yet, what was sitting quietly at the edge of everything, was Young-hee. That same morning, while Soo-hyun had been in the car driving home and Skylar had been wrapping up her client call, Jung-hee Lee was already awake and fully dressed in her suite at the Four Seasons Boston, sitting at the writing desk with a cup of tea she hadn't touched and her phone face down in front of her. She had not slept well. This was not unusual when she was in Boston. Boston was where her son lived with his wife, and whenever Young-hee came to Boston, she spent most of her nights in the particular sleeplessness that came from loving someone deeply and disagreeing with their choices completely and not knowing how to hold both things in the same hand. She was not a villain. It was important, even now, to understand that. Jung-hee Lee had spent 40 years building a family and a company capable of surviving anything. She had raised Soo-hyun alone after his father's death when the boy was 14. She had made decisions in rooms full of men who didn't believe she should be there, and she had outlasted every single one of them. She loved through provision, through protection, through preparation. She had planned her son's life the way you plan architecture, with precision, with the future in mind, but with no room left for structural weakness. Skylar Daniels had not been in the plan. That wasn't entirely about race, though if Young-hee were being completely honest, the honest answer was more complicated than she liked to admit. Mostly it was about uncertainty, about an unknown variable, about a woman who had arrived in her son's life fully formed, funny, sharp, entirely herself, with no apparent need for the Lee family's approval, and who had somehow become the center of Soo-hyun's world in 18 months without asking anyone's permission. Jung-hee had never not known the center of Soo-hyun's world. She had been it for 22 years. So yes, she had done things. A private investigator initially, just to be thorough, she told herself. A few carefully worded conversations with family associates. Questions asked through intermediaries that she would have denied asking if confronted directly. And last night, the text she had sent from the baby shower that had gone to her personal attorney. A message about accelerating a legal strategy she had been holding in reserve, waiting to see if she would need it. She had sent it because of Francis, because of the way he walked in and the room went silent and she watched her son stand beside Skylar and defend her. And in that moment she had felt, deep in her chest, the architecture she had built starting to shift. Not break, but shift. And she had panicked. Old habit. When Young-hee panicked, she reached for control. But sitting at her writing desk in the morning, quiet, tea cold beside her, she kept returning to something she couldn't set aside. After Francis was removed, after the room recovered, the way Soo-hyun came back to Skylar and kissed her temple, the way Skylar moved through the rest of the evening, not performing recovery, not manufacturing smiles for the guests, but genuinely laughing, genuinely present, genuinely herself. That wasn't a performance. Young-hee had spent her whole life reading people in rooms. That was real. And then, at 7 that morning, her attorney had called. Not about the legal strategy she'd texted him about something else entirely, something he had uncovered while running a routine background check on the Lee family's stakeholder landscape. He had found the Whitmore Group, and what he told her about them changed everything Young-hee thought she understood about the night before. Tell me in the comments, did you suspect Young-hee was hiding something? Because what she's about to discover is going to hit completely different. She called Soo-hyun at 9:15. He picked up on the second ring. She could tell from the background sound that he was at home, not the office, which she hadn't expected. Young-hee said without preamble, "I need to see you, today." Soo-hyun said, "Is everything all right?" Jung-hee said, "No." She never lied to her son directly, not once in his entire life. "There's something you need to know." There was a pause. She could hear him processing, that particular silence that was specifically Soo-hyun's, the way he always thought before he spoke, a habit she had watched develop in him since he was a small boy. Then he said, "I'll come to you." A brief pause, bringing Skylar along. Young-hee had not expected that. She had prepared for him alone. The conversation she had been building in her head for the past hour had only one other person in it. She said, "Soo-hyun," he said again, quietly but finally, "I'm coming with her, Mom." She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." They arrived at the Four Seasons at 11. Skylar came in still wearing the camel coat she hadn't had time to change out of, reading glasses pushed up on her head from the work session she had interrupted to come. She looked, Young-hee noticed this in spite of herself, like someone who ran things. There was no performance in how Skylar entered a room. She simply arrived in it, completely, and the room adjusted to her. They sat. Tea was poured. Nobody reached for it. Young-hee looked at both of them and opened with the thing she least wanted to say. First. Because if she built toward it gradually, she would find a way to soften it into something unrecognizable. Young-hee said directly, "Someone tried to use me to get to your marriage." Soo-hyun went very still. Skylar's eyes sharpened, but her face stayed level. Young-hee slid a folder across the table and said, "The people behind last night, the group that sent Francis, they approached my personal financial manager 6 months ago. They suggested I quietly move a portion of my private holdings. They framed it as protecting my assets." She paused. "In the event of a family instability scenario." Soo-hyun picked up the folder and opened it. Young-hee continued, her voice even. "They knew I had reservations about the marriage. They calculated those reservations as something they could use. They believed that my doubt would make me a door into this family." The room was quiet. Skylar opened the folder and her eyes moved across the pages quickly, absorbing, connecting, cataloging. Then she looked up and said, "This is the Whitmore Group." Young-hee looked at her and asked, "You know them?" Skylar said, "They're in my spreadsheet." A beat of complete silence. Jung-hee looked at Soo-hyun and asked, "What spreadsheet?" Soo-hyun said, with the patience of a man who had already had this conversation once that morning, "She has a spreadsheet." Young-hee said slowly, "Of course she does." And it was the tone of it, not warm, not cold, something precisely in between. Something that sounded almost exactly like reluctant respect, that made Soo-hyun look at his mother and then at his wife and feel something quietly significant happening in the room that had no name yet but was unmistakably real. Skylar turned her laptop toward Young-hee. The spreadsheet filled the screen. 8 months of color-coded, annotated investor tracking. Young-hee looked at it. Then she put on her reading glasses, the ones she always pretended she didn't need in company, and looked closer. Young-hee asked, "You built this alone?" Skylar said, "Over 4 months." Jung-hee asked, "Why didn't you bring it to Soo-hyun?" Skylar said, "I was building the case first." A brief pause. "Same reason you didn't bring your concerns to him directly. You wanted to be sure before you made it his problem." Jung-hee looked up from the screen slowly. The two women looked at each other. Across 2 years of wariness, across the table in a hotel suite, across everything that had been unsaid and sideways and unresolved between them since the day Soo-hyun brought Skylar home and said, simply, clearly, without apology, "This is the woman I am going to marry." Skylar said simply, not as a concession, but as a strategy, "We should combine what we have." Young-hee removed her reading glasses. She said, "Yes, we should." The meeting at the Four Seasons lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, the table was covered. Young-hee's attorney's report, printouts from Skylar's spreadsheet, Jin-woo's security file on Soo-hyun's tablet, 3 cold cups of tea that nobody had touched, and one very clear picture of exactly what the Whitmore Group had been building and how close it had come to working. Skylar had taken over the document layout at some point without anyone formally agreeing to let her. Both Soo-hyun and Jung-hee had simply allowed it because she was arranging everything in an order that was faster to read, and neither of them could find a reason to object. Skylar was standing, which was ambitious at 8 months pregnant, but sitting made her think slower, and she could not afford to think slower right now. She said, "The Whitmore Group's play is built entirely on timeline. The restructure vote is November 14th, 6 weeks away. They needed the scandal to land now. Early enough to affect board sentiment going in, but late enough that there's no time to fully recover before the vote." Soo-hyun said, "Which means Francis was the opening move, not the whole strategy." Skylar said, "Exactly." She looked at him. "What else are they planning?" Jin-woo, who had been sitting quietly at the edge of the room throughout the meeting, answered. He said, "We've identified 2 additional angles they may be pursuing. First, a potential leak to a financial press contact, something designed to raise questions about the North American division's Q3 projections. Second, a social media campaign that appears to be in early construction." He paused, targeting Skylar specifically. Young-hee's jaw tightened. Jin-woo continued. "The narrative they're building is that she married for access to company information, that she's been passing strategic data to a competitor." The room went very quiet. Skylar absorbed this with the stillness she reserved for information that required careful handling. Then she asked, "Who's the competitor?" Jin-woo named the company. Jung-hee made a sound. Small, sharp, involuntary. She said, "Sung Industries." Soo-hyun looked at her and asked, "You know them?" Jung-hee said, "They approached me 18 months ago about a joint venture. I declined." A brief pause. "The terms were designed to give them access to our North American client list without equivalent exchange. It was packaged as a partnership. It was a transfer." Skylar said, "And they've been building this play ever since." Jung-hee said, "It appears so." Skylar turned back to the documents and picked up 2 pages, holding them side by side. Something was moving behind her eyes. Not fear, not anger. Something more focused and more useful than either. She said, "They needed 3 things to make this work. A personal scandal to damage Soo-hyun's credibility with the board, a financial narrative to shake investor confidence, and a source inside the family they could point to as the leak." She set the pages down. "They tried to frame me as the leak, but they also positioned Jung-hee as an unwitting participant, someone whose own doubts about the marriage could be used to corroborate the story." She looked at Jung-hee directly and said, "They were going to use your reservations about me as supporting evidence, not from any particular malice toward you, just as a convenient detail that made the story more believable." Jung-hee looked at her steadily. This was the part that had kept her awake the entire previous night. And not the financial manipulation, the calculation, the way someone had looked at her love for her son, at her complicated, difficult, genuinely maternal feelings about his marriage, and seen not a mother's concern but a useful friction. Jung-hee said quietly, "They made me a pawn." Skylar said, "They tried to. They didn't get there." Something moved across Jung-hee's face. It wasn't quite gratitude. It was the particular expression of a woman who is in the process of revising something she has believed for a very long time and finding the revision uncomfortable but necessary. They left the Four Seasons at 1 in the afternoon, all 3 of them, and stood briefly on the sidewalk in the cool October Boston air, Jung-hee straight-backed and composed as always, Soo-hyun with his hands in his coat pockets, Skylar pulling her coat around her bump. Jung-hee looked at Skylar and said, "The spreadsheet." Skylar said, "I'll send you the full file tonight." Jung-hee said, "And the Francis situation?" Skylar said, "I'm handling it tomorrow." Jung-hee nodded once. She looked at her son. Something private and complete passed between them. Then she looked at Skylar one more time. She said, "You're stubborn." Skylar said, "I know." Jung-hee said, "It's not a criticism." She turned and went back inside. Soo-hyun looked at Skylar. Skylar looked at Soo-hyun. Skylar started slowly. Was that? Soo-hyun said. Don't make it weird. Skylar said, I'm not making it weird, I just… Soo-hyun said, completely straight-faced. She told you that you're stubborn. For my mother, that is basically a declaration of love. Skylar said, that is genuinely terrifying. Soo-hyun said simply, Welcome to the family. She laughed and took his arm and they walked to the car. Let me know in the comments, do you think Young-hee is finally turning a corner? Or there is still more she's not telling? The next morning, Skylar sent Francis one text. No greeting, no explanation, just coffee, Tata in Cambridge, 10 a.m., come alone. She sent it and put her phone face down and went back to her work call. She had 3 client deliverables due that week, a hostile investor situation, a mother-in-law in active emotional evolution, and a baby due in 3 weeks. The coffee with Francis was simply one item on a list. She refused to let it feel larger than that. Across the kitchen, Soo-hyun watched her from over his coffee cup with the face of a man who had agreed to something and was actively, consciously, deliberately working to trust that agreement. He said, Jin-woo will be, Skylar said without looking up. Outside, I know. He said, and you'll call if… She said, Soo-hyun. He stopped. She said, go to the office. Do work things. I'll text you when I'm leaving. He said, I will not be doing any work things. She said, that's fine. Just do them somewhere other than this kitchen so I can focus. He picked up his briefcase, came over and kissed her forehead, paused at the door. He said, Sky. She said, He said, if he says anything that makes you uncomfortable. She said, he won't. He said, but if he does… She looked up at him. Babe, I have been managing Francis Cole since I was 25. I've got him. A pause. Then he said quietly, I know. I just hate that you have to. She looked at him, soft and direct. I know you do. Go. He went. Francis was already at the coffee shop when Skylar arrived. He had a drink in front of him that he wasn't touching. He looked like a man who had spent 2 full days in the specific discomfort of knowing he had done something he could not take back and having nowhere to put that feeling. He stood up when he saw her come in. An old reflex, something his mother had taught him that his character had never quite caught up to. He said, I didn't think you'd come. Skylar sat down across from him and said, I almost didn't. She did not take her coat off. She was not staying longer than necessary. He looked at her, the pregnancy, the composure, the reading glasses she'd forgotten on top of her head again, and something in his expression rearranged itself into something genuine. Not performed remorse, actual uncomfortable self-recognition. He started, Skylar cut through it cleanly. She said, how much did they pay you? Francis went still. She said again, Francis. He said quietly, 30. She said, did you take it? A pause. Then he said, half up front. She nodded, filed it, moved forward. She said, when they contacted you, what exactly did they tell you about me? Francis looked at the table. He said, that you'd married him for access, that you'd been passing information to a competitor. He stopped. Then he said, that the baby might not be his. Skylar said, and you believed it. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. She was not going to fill his silence for him. He needed to arrive at the next part by himself. Finally, Francis said, I wanted to. The honesty of it seemed to cost him something physical. Because if you married him for money, then you're not better than me. You're just luckier. There it was. Skylar sat with that for a moment. It didn't surprise her. She had known Francis well enough once to understand exactly where that sentence came from, the specific wound of a man who had been given something real and damaged it, and could only make peace with himself by deciding the real thing was never genuine to begin with. She said, not loudly, not with anger, just the plain truth laid on the table between them. I spent 4 years trying to make myself smaller so you'd feel bigger. And when that didn't work, when I kept growing anyway, you decided the problem was me. Francis looked at the table. Skylar continued, I don't hate you for it. I did for a while, but I don't anymore. You were scared and you didn't have the language for it, and instead of finding it, you just pushed. She paused. What I will not do is let the version of me that lives in your head be used as a weapon against my family. Frances looked up at the words, my family. Something about the simple, declarative ownership of them landed differently than anything else she had said, like hearing them made real, in a way that the house and the dress and the husband had not quite made real, that Skylar Daniels was genuinely, completely, irreversibly elsewhere. She had not accidentally ended up somewhere good. She had built it, and she had chosen who to let into it, and she was standing in it with both feet planted. He had driven 4 hours to shake that. It had not moved a single inch. Frances said, his voice quieter now, the performance fully gone. They knew everything about you, these people. They knew about our marriage, when we split, your business, your clients. He hesitated. They had photos. Skylar said, what kind of photos? Frances said, you meeting someone, a man, at a restaurant in Back Bay. He paused. They said it was a competitor's executive. Skylar was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that was a client meeting. We closed a $400,000 contract at that lunch. I billed it. It's in my company records. She held his eyes. They photographed a work lunch and told you it was an affair. Frances said, I know that now. He stopped, then said very quietly, I knew it probably wasn't. I just needed it to be. Skylar said, Frances. He looked at her. She slid a notepad across the table and said, I need you to write down everything. The number they contacted you from, every name they gave you, the account the money came from, the platform they used to send the photos, every detail you can remember. He looked at the notepad. Then he asked, if I give you all of this, what happens to me? Skylar said, that depends on what the legal team decides, but I'll tell them you cooperated fully and voluntarily. That matters. Frances asked, why would you do that for me? Skylar looked at him directly and said, because I'm not trying to destroy you, Frances. I never was. I just needed you to stop trying to destroy me. He picked up the pen. He wrote for 11 minutes. She sat across from him and waited, watching people move through their Tuesday morning. Me thinking about her daughter who would be here in 3 weeks and the life she was protecting for her. When Frances finished, he pushed the notepad back across the table. She read it over carefully. Then she looked up and asked, the address confirmation, which call was that? Frances said, second call, 3 days before the shower. She asked, the baby shower address, that was sent to you on that call specifically? He said, yeah, they had it already. They just confirmed I had it too. She nodded slowly. That detail, the address being leaked 3 days before the event, was a new piece of information, and it was not a comfortable one. The baby shower location was private, not publicly listed anywhere, which meant someone inside their circle had passed it along, someone with access. She asked carefully, did they mention anyone by name? Someone inside Soo-hyun's world? Frances hesitated. Skylar said, Frances, he said, they mentioned a woman, older. They said she might be... He chose his words. They said she might be sympathetic to the message, that she'd been asking questions about you, that she didn't fully approve of the marriage. Skylar said, did they give a name? He said no, just that she was family, someone close to him. Skylar sat with that, kept her face neutral, filed it. She stood up, picked up the notepad, looked at Frances one final time. This man she had once loved in the way you love someone before you fully know yourself, when you mistake familiarity for depth and intensity for compatibility. She said, for what it's worth, I hope you figure it out. Frances looked up and said, figure what out? Skylar said, whatever it is that makes you do this, I hope you find it and fix it. She said it without cruelty. Because you're not a bad person, Frances. You're a person who made a bad decision. There's a difference, and you're the only one who gets to decide which one stays with you. She walked out. Jin-woo was parked directly across the street. She got in the back seat and handed him the notepad without a word. He looked at the pages, then at her face. Jin-woo asked, everything all right? Skylar said, drive. She was already dialing. Soo-hyun picked up on the first ring. Skylar said, I have everything. The number, the contact chain, the account information. She paused. And something new. They had the baby shower address 3 days before. It was leaked from inside. Soo-hyun said, "Who?" Skylar said, "I don't know yet. But I need to talk to Young-hee before we take anything to legal. Can you call her?" Soo-hyun said, "Already on it." A brief pause, then quieter. "Are you okay?" The real answer. She thought about it honestly. The coffee shop, Francis's face, the pen moving across that notepad. She said, "Yeah, I actually am." She heard him exhale on the line. He said, "I'll see you at home." She said, "I love you." He said, "I love you back." She kept her eyes on the window. Boston in October, the trees just beginning to turn. Somewhere in this city, in a building full of people who had built a careful plan around underestimating her, the clock was running out. Drop a like if you are completely hooked right now, and comment below, who do you think leaked that baby shower address? Because the answer is about to change everything. The call between Soo-hyun and Jung-hee lasted 4 minutes. Jung-hee listened to everything. The leaked address, Skylar's meeting with Francis, the implication that someone close to their family had been feeding information to the Whitmore group. When Soo-hyun finished, the line held a moment of silence. Then Jung-hee said, "Come tonight. Bring Skylar." Soo-hyun said, "Mom, if you already know something..." Jung-hee said, "Tonight, Soo-hyun." He recognized that tone. The tone she used when she had already decided to do something hard and was only waiting for the logistics to arrange themselves. He didn't push. They arrived at the Four Seasons at 7. Jung-hee had ordered dinner, real dinner, not hotel snacks, actual food arranged properly on the suite table, which Skylar noticed immediately because Jung-hee had never once ordered food for her before. Small thing, she noted it anyway. Jung-hee waited until the server left before she spoke. She said, "The address. I know how it was leaked." Both of them looked at her. Jung-hee said, "My personal assistant handles my correspondence and my calendar. When I received the baby shower invitation, she entered it into my digital schedule as standard practice. My calendar syncs with my attorney's office system, a connection I authorized 2 years ago for scheduling and never revoked." Her voice was completely controlled, but her hands, Skylar noticed, were folded very tightly on the table in front of her. The consulting firm the Whitmore Group used to run their operation, they share a systems infrastructure with my attorney's office. They accessed my calendar. They took the address directly from my own schedule. The table was quiet. Soo-hyun said slowly, "They didn't need a source inside the family." Jung-hee said, "No, they just needed a door I had already left open without knowing it." She looked at her hands. "I gave them the address, without knowing I was giving it to them." Skylar leaned forward carefully and said, "Jung-hee, the man I spoke to today, Francis, said the group mentioned a woman, someone they believed might be sympathetic to their narrative, someone who didn't fully approve of the marriage." She paused. "Did anyone from this group ever contact you directly? Any communication that felt like they were testing where you stood?" Jung-hee was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There was an email, 6 weeks ago, from an address I didn't fully recognize. It was framed as a concerned investor reaching out about the stability of the Lee family's North American leadership. It asked whether I had any concerns about recent personal decisions affecting the board's perception of the company." Skylar asked, "What did you respond?" Jung-hee said, "I didn't respond. I flagged it to my attorney as suspicious and deleted it." Skylar said carefully, "And your attorney told you..." Jung-hee said, "He told me it was likely a phishing attempt, that I shouldn't engage." Skylar looked at Soo-hyun. Soo-hyun looked at Skylar. Skylar said very carefully, "Jung-hee, who is your attorney?" The name Jung-hee gave landed in the room like something dropped from a significant height. Soo-hyun's expression didn't change visibly. Oh, but his stillness changed quality, the way a room's atmosphere shifts when the power cuts out. He said quietly, "Mom, we need to check his connection to the Whitmore Group. Tonight." Jung-hee said simply, "I know." Jin-woo had the preliminary connection confirmed by 9:30 that same evening. Jung-hee's attorney of 11 years had been retained by a Whitmore Group subsidiary 18 months prior, 3 months before that same group began formally building their hostile restructure strategy. He had not disclosed this conflict of interest to Jung-hee. He had continued managing her affairs, handling her correspondence, and maintaining access to her calendar, while the people paying him built a plan that depended entirely on the access her trust in him had provided. The conflict sat in a gray space between professional negligence and deliberate betrayal. But combined with everything else, the calendar breach, the leaked address, the suspicious email he had advised her to delete rather than report, it formed a picture that legal could work with effectively. Jung-hee fired him by text at 10:15, 2 sentences, no drama, just the clean, final close of a door. Then she sat in her suite and did something that Soo-hyun had only witnessed twice in his entire adult life. She let herself be still, not composed, not performing composure, just still. The particular stillness that comes after something you had half hoped was wrong gets confirmed. Soo-hyun sat down next to her on the couch. He didn't speak immediately. He hadn't said anything to her yet about the private investigator she had hired 2 years ago, about the background checks, about the various things she had done since his wedding that he had known about and chosen, carefully and deliberately, not to confront, because he had never believed his mother was his enemy. He had believed, and continued to believe, that underneath the control and the fear, she was a woman who loved her son in the only language she had ever been taught. He had been waiting, not with resentment, just waiting for her to reach the place where she could see clearly. Jung-hee said, not to him specifically, just aloud into the room, "I made it easy for them." Soo-hyun said, "Yes, honest because she deserved honesty, but you also made it impossible for them. When you called me and told me to bring Skylar." Jung-hee looked at him. He said, "They built their entire strategy on the assumption that you would never work with her, that your doubt would keep you on the outside, available, isolated, usable." He held her gaze. "And then you called and told me to bring her." Jung-hee was quiet for a long time. Then she said, almost to herself, "She had a spreadsheet." Soo-hyun said, "She had a spreadsheet." Something that was very nearly a laugh moved through Jung-hee. It didn't quite arrive, but it was close, and it was real. Across the suite, Skylar was at the writing desk, reading glasses on, Jin-woo's legal documents spread in front of her, highlighter moving across pages with the focused efficiency of someone who was entirely in their element. She had not inserted herself into the couch conversation. She had found the most useful thing she could do and was quietly doing it. Jung-hee watched her for a moment. She said very quietly to Soo-hyun, "She doesn't need my approval." Soo-hyun said, "No, she never did." Jung-hee said, "I think that's what frightened me. A woman who doesn't need your approval is impossible to manage." She paused. "I have spent my whole life managing things because it was the only way I knew to keep them safe." Soo-hyun waited. Jung-hee said, "Your father made me feel for 20 years that if I took my eyes off something for one moment, it would be taken from me." She said it without drama, like something she was setting down after carrying it for a long time. "I transferred that onto you. I have been watching your life like it was something that could be stolen if I stopped paying attention." Soo-hyun was quiet. Jung-hee said, "Skylar didn't take you. She..." She paused, and when the words came, they were slow and considered. "She built something with you." Soo-hyun said, "She did." Jung-hee looked at her son, then across the room at Skylar, still working at the desk, one hand resting on her bump without thinking about it, the way she always rested her hand there now. Jung-hee said very quietly, "She's going to be a good mother." It was the first time she had said anything like that. In 2 years. The first time, without qualification and without condition, she had simply said something true about the woman her son had married. Soo-hyun looked at his mother for a long moment. He said, "She already is." The Whitmore group did not see it coming. That was the part Soo-hyun would think about later, when he had distance from it and could look back at the whole shape of what had happened. You can plan for an opponent's strength. What nobody adequately plans for is an opponent who is smarter than your intelligence on them suggested, who has been paying attention longer than you realized, and who built the architecture of your defeat before you finished building the architecture of your attack. The legal team had the combined file on their desks by the morning of the second day after the Four Seasons meeting. Skylar's spreadsheet, Jinwoo's security report, Francis's handwritten notes, Jung-hee's attorney documentation, the calendar breach data, the full chain. It took the senior legal partner 40 minutes to read through everything, 20 minutes to make 3 phone calls, and 1 hour to draft the filing that would begin dismantling the Whitmore Group's position in the restructure vote. The filing cited coordinated market manipulation, breach of fiduciary responsibility through a conflicted legal representative, and deliberate interference in the personal affairs of a corporate officer with intent to affect board perception, which, under Massachusetts law, carried specific and serious exposure. By Thursday, 2 of the group's 3 key investors had quietly withdrawn their restructure challenge rather than face discovery proceedings. The third held on for 4 more days, received a very detailed and very specific letter from the Lee family's legal team, and withdrew on Monday morning. The November vote would go forward. The Lee family's controlling stake was not just intact. The attempted attack had triggered a full audit of the North American division that identified 3 operational inefficiencies the company could now correct. Estimated savings, $18 million over the next fiscal year. In the board statement Soo-hyun prepared to close the matter, he thanked his legal team and his head of security. He thanked his mother. Then he said, "Most significantly, I want to acknowledge my wife, Skylar, who had been independently tracking this situation for 4 months before any of our formal systems identified it. If we had listened sooner, this would have ended sooner. I want that on record." Jung-hee was seated at the board table when those words landed. She heard her son say her daughter-in-law's name in front of the most powerful room in their family's professional life and attribute the survival of everything they had built, not to a strategy, not to a system, not to a legal maneuver, but to a woman with a color-coded spreadsheet who had been paying attention when no one thought to ask her to. Jung-hee picked up her water glass and set it back down. She did not cry. She was Jung-hee Lee, and she had not cried in a boardroom in 40 years. But something settled in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. That evening, Soo-hyun came home to find Skylar asleep on the couch. This happened sometimes now. She would sit down for what she intended to be 5 minutes and simply be unconscious. Because growing a human being in the final stretch required a level of energy that her body had decided to collect at every available opportunity. He stood in the doorway for a moment and just looked at her. 8 months pregnant. Reading glasses slightly askew on her face, laptop open on the cushion beside her, a half-finished document still on the screen. Her hand resting on her bump the way it always did when she slept now, instinctive, unthinking, already protective in ways she didn't notice herself doing. He thought about what he had said in that boardroom, the way the room went quiet when he said her name. He had meant every word of it, not as a performance for his colleagues, not as a point to make, but as the simple and accurate truth. Skylar had seen what they had missed. She had worked the problem in silence, without recognition, carrying it alongside her regular work and her pregnancy and the social weight of being the woman his family was still deciding what to make of. She had carried all of it and said nothing and showed up to that coffee shop and gotten what they needed with nothing but clarity and honesty and the absolute refusal to be cruel to a man who had been cruel to her. Soo-hyun sat carefully on the edge of the couch. She stirred slightly. Opened one eye. Skylar said, thick with sleep, "Hey." Soo-hyun said, "Hey." She looked at his face with the specific literacy that came from 2 years of paying close attention to him. She said, "How was the board thing?" He said, "Done." She said, "Done?" He said, "Done." She closed her eye and said, "Good." A pause. "Did you say my name?" He said, "In front of everyone." She said again, softer, "Good." Another pause. "You should have." He put his hand over hers on her bump. She turned her hand over without opening her eyes and laced her fingers through his. Skylar said, "Soo-hyun." He said, She said, "We're going to be okay." "I know." She said, "Like, really okay. Not just us. All of it. Your mom, the company, the baby, all of it." He said, "Skylar." "What?" He said, "I know." Quietly. Completely. "I have known that for 2 years." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She's going to be a handful." He said, "Our daughter." Skylar said. She has been pressing on my ribs since 7 this morning like she's trying to rearrange furniture in there. She has opinions. Soo-hyun said. She gets that honestly. Skylar said, without moving. Don't start. He smiled. The real one. The one that only came out when she made him laugh at a moment he wasn't braced for it. She could feel him smiling even with her eyes closed. 2 years and she could still feel that smile like a change in the room temperature. He said, Go to sleep. She said, I am asleep. You're talking. I can do both. He kept his hand over hers. She kept her fingers laced through his. Outside, Boston moved through its evening, ordinary and continuous and entirely indifferent to the fact that in one house in Brookline, something had just quietly and permanently settled into place. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, Skylar's water broke at 6:47 while she was standing at the kitchen counter eating toast and reviewing a client brief. She looked down. She looked at the floor. She looked up at the ceiling briefly. In the specific way a person looks at the ceiling when a feeling is too large for their face to contain. Then she called up the stairs. She said, Soo-hyun. Nothing. She said louder, So-hyun. The sound of something being knocked over upstairs, then feet on the stairs, fast. He appeared at the kitchen doorway in a half-buttoned shirt, tie in hand, already running late for a morning call, and looked at her. She looked at the floor, looked back at him. He looked at the floor. Soo-hyun said very calmly, Okay. A beat. Okay, Skylar said. The bag is by the front door. He said, I know where the bag is. Your shirt is still. I'll button it in the car. She said, You cannot button a shirt while. He said, Skylar, let's go. She grabbed her phone, her chapstick, and her toast. She was finishing the toast, she had not had breakfast, and she was not going to a hospital without breakfast. And they went. Brigham and Women's Hospital, Boston. 14 hours later, because Ariam Daniels Lee had strong opinions about her own schedule, as had been well established over the previous 8 months, she arrived. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Born at 9:12 in the evening in a room with good light, and a nurse named Patricia, who had the specific calming authority of a woman who had done this 10,000 times. Soo-hyun was there for every single second of it. He held Skylar's hand through the hard parts, and at one point she looked at him and said, very clearly and directly, that if he said the words "you're doing so well" one more time, she was going to. And then a contraction arrived, and the sentence didn't finish. He did not say those words again. When it was over, when the room had gone quiet and warm and that particular sacred stillness of the first few minutes had settled in, the nurse placed Ariam on Skylar's chest. And everything that had happened. Francis walking through the door with his rehearsed smile, the Whitmore group, the spreadsheet, Young-hee at the Four Seasons, the board meeting, the 14 hours of labor, every single thing before and between and leading to this moment. It all became, in an instant, simply the road that had ended here. Skylar looked down at her daughter. Ariam had her father's quiet eyes and somehow already, and her mother's expression, the particular look of someone assessing a room and not yet being fully impressed. Skylar said very softly, Hi. A breath. Hi, baby. Her voice was different than any version of itself that had appeared in this story, stripped of everything except what was most real. Soo-hyun was looking at both of them, not speaking. His face was doing something it had never been asked to do before, holding a feeling too large for the vocabulary he had available. He was a man who had always known exactly what to say in difficult rooms, in board meetings, in quiet moments that mattered. And this was the first moment in his adult life where he had nothing. Not because something was wrong, because something was so completely and overwhelmingly right that language was simply the wrong tool for it. Oh, he held Ariam for the first time and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, She looks like she's judging me. Skylar said, She got that from me. He laughed, helpless, undone, completely in love with both of them in a way that had no bottom to it. In the waiting room down the hall, 2 women were sitting side by side. Diane Williams, Skylar's mother, had been there since 4 in the afternoon. She had a knitting bag she had not opened and a magazine she had not read and had cried quietly at least 4 times in the previous 2 hours. She was the kind of woman who cried from fullness, not grief, who had raised her daughter alone and worked hard and watched that daughter become something extraordinary and now sat in a hospital waiting room feeling all of that arrive somewhere complete. Jung-hee Lee arrived at 7. She came in wearing her coat, composed as always, and sat down 2 seats away from Diane. They had not spent real time alone together before. They were not, in any ordinary version of life, women who would have found each other. They sat in the quiet of the waiting room. After a while, Diane said, not to anyone specifically, just out loud, "She takes after her grandmother." Jung-hee looked at her. Diane said, smiling at nothing in particular, "Stubborn, determined, has to do everything herself." She paused. "Gets under your skin until you realize halfway through that she's right and you've already lost and you just have to figure out how to exit with your dignity." Jung-hee considered this for a moment. Then she said, "That is accurate." Diane said, "She was like that at 5 years old. I used to argue with her and then realize I had been wrong from the beginning and she had known it the whole time." Something that was fully, genuinely a laugh escaped Jung-hee before she could decide whether to allow it or not. Diane looked at her, surprised, pleased. She reached into her bag and found a pack of gum. She held a piece out toward Jung-hee. Jung-hee looked at it for a moment, then she took it. They sat in the easy, unforced silence of 2 women waiting for the same good news, side by side in plastic chairs under fluorescent lights on a Tuesday evening in October in Boston. It was not a grand moment. Nobody would have filmed it. It would not be the kind of thing that got told at parties. But when Soo-hyun walked out to the waiting room 20 minutes later to find his mother and his mother-in-law sitting next to each other, coats still on, handbags in their laps, in the particular stillness of women who have been through something together, he stopped walking, just looked at them. He said simply, "She's here." Diane stood up immediately, hands over her mouth, already crying before she had fully risen from the chair. Jung-hee stood more slowly. She smoothed her coat. She looked at her son, at his face, which was still doing the thing it had been doing in the delivery room, the overwhelmed, undone, completely undefended thing, and she crossed to him and placed her hand briefly on his face, the way she had when he was a boy and she needed him to know without words that she was there. She said quietly, "Go back. Be with your family." He put his hand over hers for one moment. Then he went. Skylar was sitting up in the hospital bed with Aryam asleep on her chest when Jung-hee came in, just for a moment, just briefly, while Soo-hyun and Diane were handling paperwork in the hallway. She carried a tote bag. She set it on the chair by the bed without making anything of it. Jung-hee said, "Miyok-guk, hospital food is terrible and you'll need to eat properly. It's for when you're ready." Skylar looked at the bag, then at Jung-hee. She said, "You made it yourself?" Jung-hee said, "Obviously." A beat of quiet. Then Skylar said, tired and honest in the way people are honest when every defense has finally come all the way down, "Thank you for coming to us when you found out what they were doing. It mattered." Jung-hee stood at the side of the bed and looked at Aryam, at this small, new, entirely unaware person who was her son's daughter and this woman's daughter, and a Lee whether she had the word for it yet. Jung-hee said, "I should have come sooner. For different reasons entirely. I should have come sooner." Skylar met her eyes. The silence between them was different now. Not the silence of 2 people circling each other waiting for the other to move first, but the silence of 2 people who have said enough for today and both know it and are genuinely, quietly, okay with that. Skylar said, "There's time." Jung-hee nodded once. She didn't hug her. She was not there yet, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. But she looked at Aryam one more time, a long, unhurried look, and something in her face opened the way a window opens when someone finally finds the right angle and the right amount of force. Slowly, completely. She left. Later that night, when the hospital had settled into its nighttime quiet, and Aryam was in the bassinet, and Soo-hyun was technically asleep in the chair beside the bed, the faithful, stubborn sleep of a man who refused to go home. Skylar lay awake in the dark and thought about all of it. The baby shower. Frances walking through the door with that smile. Soo-hyun appearing at her side, not in front of her, beside her, exactly beside her, every single time. The spreadsheet. The Four Seasons table covered in documents. Frances's pen moving across the notepad for 11 minutes. Young-hee at the kitchen door with groceries. Oh, two women in a waiting room sharing a piece of gum. She thought about what it had cost. The energy of being watched and doubted and targeted and underestimated. Not for the first time in her life, not the last, but this time with everything she loved most at stake. And then she thought about what it had built. Because that was the thing about going through something hard with people. It didn't just survive the difficulty. It constructed something the difficulty had been designed to prevent. Trust that had been tested and had not moved. Understanding between two women who had been circling each other from a careful distance for 2 years and had finally, reluctantly, necessarily stepped into the same room. A family, not the one anyone had planned. The one that had happened anyway, through stubbornness and love and a very detailed spreadsheet and 14 hours of labor and a piece of gum in a hospital waiting room. Skylar looked at her daughter sleeping in the bassinet. She said quietly, "Aram, there is going to come a day when someone tells you that you are too much, too loud, too certain, too particular about things that matter to you." Aram slept. Skylar continued, "I need you to know that those people are describing your best qualities badly. Don't fix it. Don't shrink it. Find someone who thinks those things are the best parts of you. That's not the problem." From across the room, Soo-hyun said, very quietly, "Not asleep after all." "She already has 2 people who think that." Skylar looked at him. He was watching her from the chair in the dark with that steady attention that had been her favorite thing about him since the night they met at a fundraiser, and he had laughed 3 times in 20 minutes and looked at her like he couldn't quite believe she was real. She said, 3. Your mom came around. He said, "She came around." Skylar said, "It only took 2 years, 1 hostile investor operation, a paternity allegation, a corporate conspiracy, and a baby." Soo-hyun said, completely straight-faced, "She's efficient." Skylar laughed, quiet, genuine, the laugh that still caught him off guard every single time. And the hospital room held it for a moment before the night went still again. If this story got to you, if any part of it stayed with you, hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment below. Tell me your favorite moment. Tell me when you knew Skylar was going to win. Tell me if Young-hee walking in with that soup got you, because it should have. See you next time.